Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second episode of At Pace, which is your people and culture talk show. Uh, Welcome once again. We got breaking news coming in, of course, from the UK that the Prime Minister has resigned, but let's get to that in some time. My name is Jonathan Rodrigues. I'm going to be your host this morning. The People and Culture Talk Show is meant to be an unrehearsed, unscripted, unfiltered perspective on trending workplace culture news. And right now, I think the topic that's on top of everyone's head is the number of strikes and the growing number of strikes in the UK. They're calling it the summer of strikes, and we got three fantastic gentlemen to talk to us about it today. Um, Let me get quickly to introducing them. They got splendid CVs, but that will take me an hour by itself to get to them. So very quickly, Andy Robinson joining us. He's an experienced employment law consultant, practitioner with over 19 years experience undertaking problem-solving, complex and ever-changing area of the UK employment matters, predominantly in employee relations. He is, of course, in the TCM with us as a consultant, and he consults on mediation and workplace investigation. Thank you for joining us, Andy. Ebrahim Patelia, who joins us from Johannesburg in South Africa. He is the CEO and founder of the law firm Patelia Attorneys and Mediate Works. So go check that out, of course, online. Ebrahim is a practicing attorney, a senior multidisciplinary mediator, arbitrator, trainer, assessor, and an academic. His practice involves commercial, social, political, family, community dispute resolution. But of course, today we're looking at some insights from him from the employment sector, which he does some fantastic work back there in Johannesburg. Also joining us close to home is Stephen Adams, who is the head of our transformational programs at the TCM Group, a role which spans culture change, resolution, and leadership development offerings. Stephen spent 26 years with Lloyds Banking Group in various director and executive roles prior to joining the TCM Group. As an accredited mediator, investigator, and executive coach, he brings an extensive knowledge of all forms of conflict resolution. Gentlemen, the Deputy Secretary of the Trades Union Congress, Paul Novak, called this a culture war. And it's interesting for him to use those really, really strong words. But this is something that's, I think, taken a few people by shock. From railway workers to barristers, firefighters, doctors, post office workers, teachers, nurses, civil servants, council workers to British Telecom engineers. This is an unusually large potential strike wave that's building. What are your initial thoughts? I'm going to throw it out straight across to you, Stephen.
So I think it's a fascinating kind of situation at the moment. And just from my experience, probably over recent months, I think there's a real disconnect between HR teams and departments, organisations, and unions, whereas you should be actually coming together when there's times of problems or kind of unease, etc. But it seems to me people are being done to and not involved, which is creating that mistrust, which I can definitely see. And then I think also during the pandemic, I heard a really good quote from David Liddell the other day, the CEO of TCM, saying we've trusted people for the last 2 years. We've given them complete autonomy during the pandemic. We've said to them, look, we trust you, look after your family, come to work differently, etc. And then we've brought them back into the workplace and then micromanaging them again to take away that trust. So I can see a real tension there. It'll be really good to talk about kind of salaries, inflation, and kind of that stuff later. But I just kind of, that's what I'm seeing at the moment is a lack of connection. When there's a problem, you've got to come closer together rather than it seems to be we're going further apart. That's where I'm seeing at the moment.
Do you think we weren't ready for bringing back the industry? Is that right, Stephen? We weren't prepared, and we didn't prepare the workforces coming back into work.
I think there's a bit there of there's a happy medium to go. Actually, the workforce coming back in, or how we're doing, remote working, hybrid working, evolution working, however we want to call it. I think there's a bit there of people are reverting back to management type. Rather than actually really going into the new world, retrying adaptability, agile management, those kind of perspective. I think we've reverted back to what people know from pre-pandemic.
It's interesting to see there, and Stephen will be aware of this, that the artificial intelligence companies and so on, began to grow massively during the pandemic. Some people were trusted just simply to get on with it, whereas others immediately went into a state of panic. And all of a sudden we have monitoring going on right, left and centre. And I'm a member of a couple of groups that have discussed this, and there's been some kind of, I think, shock from HR people that employers have acted this way. But I'm thankful to say, I think the draconian idea that you must be in a physical office 5 days a week, 9 till 5, is long gone. Obviously, that has other dangers and difficulties. I think most of us who've been working from home have been working longer hours. I know Stephen and I certainly have. But that's you have to manage that. I think at home, have your own space for where you do work, and then I'm in the study right now. When I leave the study, that's it for me.
Yeah, Jonathan, I mean, we've seen the similar thing. I mean, in my context, of course, I don't live in the UK and I'm not experienced in the UK, but the need within collective bargaining for workers to obtain a greater value, given the sacrifices that have been made over COVID. Remember, it was all for one and one for all. Now it's back to, let's fight for what you need. The argument doesn't fly. There needs to be a greater value proposition for workers. And I see, and again, from the outside, just reading articles, is that they, what I understand to be macro issues, and then the micro issues, which I think largely could be managed in normal employment relations. And there's a greater need for that. And we can talk about that a bit later. But at a macro level, I think what we see in collective bargaining or negotiations of this nature generally is that there's a need to shift the culture away from what is effectively seen as really restrictive strike laws generally within the country, but also the power balance more so towards what would be termed the capitalist employer. And I think those are really macro issues. And of course, the dynamics that attach itself from a cultural perspective, where people are shocked, if you hear some of the language used in news reports, shocked that people could embark upon a strike of this mass nature across. It's not within the DNA that existed from the 70s potentially, whereas we would be shocked in South Africa if people don't go on strikes, and we are grateful where there's no violence in strikes. So, potentially what we see is that there's a need to shift the power balance. And unfortunately, if that's not done through dialogue, it's going to be done through a lot of power. So for me, I see a lot of macro issues, which, there needs to be greater conversations. If not, it's going to be pushed. And then internally, how are these issues really managed in these particular strikes that are occurring largely in what the public requires from a service perspective? Again, not unusual, because that's where it hits hard and connects business, it connects government, and it connects the trade unions in a perfect triangle. And of course, community gets involved, and now you've got a square. So it's the best place to hit.
That's an excellent observation, because as you've touched upon there, the UK has about the most restrictive employment laws, certainly in terms of industrial action, in Western Europe. And that's the context in which we're operating here. And in addition to that, of course, only about 22% of the private sector is covered by collective bargaining. So that obviously reduces the likelihood of any official industrial action anyway. So these are interesting times that we're in at the moment.
There's of course the political side to this, and there is the legal side to this as well. But I just want to kind of take a step back here and look at this from just the people who are affected by the problem. And there's some very, very interesting quotes that are coming out there. This is from one of the barristers, criminal law barristers who were on strike, and he said, "We are not being greedy. We are not fat cats. There have been a series of brutal cuts to our funding at a time when also over the years the demand for the job has increased." And this is something similar to what Ebrahim said about extra workload coming in. And he continues to say that we are not only getting paid less, but we are being asked to do more for less. And we have reached an existential crisis that the criminal bar is hemorrhaging members. Now, these are some really strong words. And this is kind of in tune to what also the TUC General Secretary Francis O'Grady said. This government, I think, doesn't get the majority of the public service workforce and our memberships are women. And what I really get when I speak to care workers, nurses, and this is what she says, cleaners, that they are fed up with the patrician attitude as if our wages don't count, and they do. So I'm trying to also kind of get this back here and to say that, is it fair to then say that there has been a clear indifference, clear lack of empathy during the talks, during these conversations that are taking place?
I think there, Jonathan, I think there's a real disconnect between what people understand on the ground. And I'm a great believer of, really find out what's going on the ground, have some good focus groups, talk to people how they're feeling. Because most of the work that we do, people just want their voice heard rather than being done to. And I think there's a lot of decisions I've seen made recently. There's some of it, I'm not an agreeer of strikes. So my own personal opinion is I think it causes too much disruption for other people. So if you took the recent rail strikes, people trying to get medical care, etc. So I think there's a knock-on effect, and that's what they're designed to do, is to have a kind of big impact. I get it. But what I've seen recently is a fairness. There's not a fairness or a spirit. And I think in the UK more we've seen over recent years is the spirit and tone of things being done. Not necessarily breaking rules, but the spirit. The UK definitely, people saying that's not the spirit we would expect. And I've seen now with different bits. So if you took Rolls-Royce, I think Rolls-Royce made a decent offer to their employees, giving them, I think, £2,000 each employee. So you had the non-unionised colleagues accept it, but the unionised colleagues said, no, that's not enough. And I think that's a little bit naughty because they don't have to do anything. I know it's a big company, but they don't have to do anything. Lloyd's Banking Group gave £1,000 to each employee, and that was accepted from that point of view. They don't have to do that, but they've done it, I think, out of goodwill and that kind of bit. British Airways, I think, have really let themselves down because they've got people back to work, working their normal hours, but they all had to take a 10% reduction in their salary. But they haven't replenished it. So there's a difference there. I go, that's not fair. But I think sometimes with the unions and also employees, we just got to look at what's fair and appropriate. That's what I kind of come from that point of view. So probably that's where I kind of see the salaries, payments to people, etc. I kind of see the fairness, if that makes sense. And if I took a corporate, I think Deloitte Touche paid their employees 9% pay rise. Well, I'm not being funny. You're not going to get that in the NHS. That's probably not going to happen. So I just think we need to be kind of what's real, what's going to happen, what's kind of versus kind of higher expectations that's never been done before. So probably that's me putting the cat amongst the pigeons a bit.
Well, okay. Sense. I mean, I respond. The whole purpose of industrial action ballots is not actually to cause chaos. It's to bring the employers back to the table to discuss, because in essence negotiations have failed. Yeah. And I think that's the position that we've come to. And I mean, that's where the RMT are right now. And I mean, if we want to talk in terms of fairness, you'll probably be aware that both First Group and Go Ahead are subject to takeover bids because they're actually so attractive to private sector investors. And during the pandemic, the train operating companies, the rolling stock companies, etc., made £500 million of profit in the worst year of rail revenue. And in essence, what the government is doing is subsidizing shareholder profit. So this is the reason why we're in this situation. Yeah. I mean, offering the perspective on fairness, we'll be aware that in the UK, in the late 1970s, I think the average CEO got paid something like 12 times as much as the average worker. Now it's something like 178 times the average worker.
So, but of course, Ebrahim, before you come in, just very quickly, just to catch on what Stephen just also said, of course, the expression of a strike is because there is conflict, and it is an attempt to escalate conflicts to find resolution. Would you then suppose that UK should have taken some of the inspiration from Australia and Japan, where when their road transport went on strike, they actually they ran the transport services, but they asked the people not to pay. So it was basically keeping the service on to the people, not disrupting life out there, but yet making their point clear very loudly to everyone.
Well, Yeah, I mean, that's certainly an option. I mean, you'll be aware at the moment that Grant Shapps is not involved in the negotiations. And the employers have said to Mick Lynch that they could give, because part of the issue here is no compulsory redundancies. Now the employers want to give that assurance there, but they're saying the government won't let them. So I think that there is a case for this. I mean, what we have in Germany, of course, is the more traditional tripartite agreement, where you have,
Right.
you know, the government, the trade unions, and the employers sat down together, and that has been much more successful. Of course, part of the problem there is that we used to be, of course, very much an exporting economy and a high-skilled production economy, but we subsequently became very much dependent upon financial services, which means that, you know, we have a situation like we have now in Ukraine, where Mr. Putin, of course, threatens to turn the gas taps off. Now, if we still had our own supply of coal, and I get all the issues about fossil fuels and so on and so forth, but if we still had our own supply of coal, not only would those communities, I feel, be in a much better shape today up here in the north, where Doncaster, you know, go down to Wakefield and so on and so forth, they're a shadow of themselves, of what they were. They've never completely recovered. But also, you have a resource. And sometimes the problem is, in the past, we've measured the price of everything and the value of nothing. And that's where you come to when you just completely look at market forces and apply it. Of course, market forces have never been applied to the farming industry. Of course, that might have something to do with the government's reliant upon that industry for votes. But in respect of energy and respect of our resources, I think it's a little bit foolish just to sell everything off to the highest bidder. Basically, I think that because we're seeing the fruits of that now. It's all right when everything is fine, but you get a little bit of international conflict, and we see the result.
Jonathan, if I may come in, is that, you know, I think for me is you've got to consider what are the policy choices made from a dispute resolution perspective. The legitimization of negotiations should, in essence, harness the voice of the worker and the employer, and in a perfect world, there should be a listening to those voices and then a meeting of the minds. Now, if we understand that and then we judge outcomes on the basis of what is fair or not, the reality is that we should be then looking at mechanisms that would find decisions like wage arbitrations that could potentially resolve matters on the basis of fairness. Now, if we're not in that realm, clearly the ability of a worker to exercise their voice and then utilize the only means is through the legitimate use of power indicates, and we must appreciate that on both sides, they are active, equal, quite sophisticated players, that they're making those decisions in their best interest. Now, if we sit from the outside, and again, I think this is partly some of the issues, and even myself sitting here, not even within your country and saying, I'm going to judge the outcomes, I'm going to judge your decisions, is in my view part of the problem. From a macro perspective, what I'm seeing is that a worker and a union does not only see the fundamental micro issues that are important for them, which I believe can be resolved through effective negotiations, but now you're getting an attack from policy perspective that's been in the making for quite a while as to utilization of agency workers. We're talking about things like the Williams Review, use of technology and advancements which workers interpret as loss of jobs. In fact, the issue is not made smaller to find resolution. It is in fact made bigger. And the trade-off here, what was interesting is that, well, you give us reform as workers, and we'll give you a salary increase and of course other conditions. Now, those are very distinct issues. Can you really trade off those items fairly, even within one negotiations? I think the expectation is far too high within the negotiations to say, well, we've got to trade off major policy issues around a review that takes place, for example, in the rail industry that fundamentally changes, whether for safety or not, how workers are going to operate, whether they'll be employed. I think those are issues that we can't take necessarily lightly. I wouldn't judge it easily on the basis of fairness. Of course, in different sectors, you could say, well, there's phenomenal increases. For example, I think in the airline sector, about 22% or whatever the figure is astronomical. And for workers to say I want 50% more, no one's going to support that. But this strike seems to be getting the support of people on the ground, and that's pretty interesting for me. And I think for me is to say, well, if you're in the system of negotiation, there's a legitimate voice. Are we really listening? The second thing for me, what is interesting, who's around the table? Are the right people around the table in the negotiation? So the fundamentals are there. If you're pulling back and politicizing who should be there, and you're the main funder, rightly or wrongly, of the rail industry, and you're saying, well, hold on, I can't be there. It is a typical employer-employee relationship, but still potentially give a mandate or a restrictive mandate or no mandate, you're creating an issue that's not going to be taken lightly. Now, I'm not pro-union or pro-employer, but what's happening here from the fundamentals around process and the way the problem is being dealt with and how the people are being dealt with, the 3 Ps that we as mediators would know, I think there's a lot to introspect as to how to better do it. And if this is going to get resolved, I think there must be a fundamental respect of the people in this, the legitimacy of their voices, and also recognition that it's not going to go away by pushing down major policy issues. All it is doing, in my view, is it's strengthening the trade unions where it was fairly, I wouldn't say dormant, but inactive in this space for a while. But it's certainly going to play against those that are using policy that wants to shift the balance away from trade unions. Again, these are observations from the outside.
Well, I think
Very interesting one.
No, that is interesting. Of course, with the more recent act, the Trade Union Act that was brought in, requiring, balloting process has always been very complex anyway in the UK. It just made it even more complex. But it's interesting to see that the CWU, the RMT, have smashed those bars quite significantly. I think BT had a 75% turnout. And remember, online voting is not allowed. That was one of the things the TUC asked for. If you're going to reform the law, then make it fair. Let's have online voting. So it is interesting here that even notwithstanding those difficulties, the thresholds have not just been met, but significantly exceeded. The public do seem to be on the side of particular British Airways. Just to add on for what Stephen was saying there, not only have they not reinstated the 10% cut, which was seen to, and this shows you how pragmatic people can be when they say, okay, I may not have a job, I'll take a cut, but the bosses have had theirs reinstated, and I think that is the sort of that's the context in which people are working with. But I would say, I think that most trade unions, if not all trade unions, would welcome a change in the structure, a complete overhaul in the structure. Because even when there is a strike, take the current disputes that are going on, trade union leaders will be aware that you have to have an outcome. You have to have you want to come out of this with some dignity. So, as a consequence, the more safeguards that you have in there to ensure that works, the better. And I think that things do need looking at again. There's no question about that.
Talking about negotiation strategies, I think what I'm also trying to wrap my head around is this fact of how, I guess, and I may be wrong, but Stephen and Ebrahim and Andy, go for it, but there was a bit of a blanketing strategy that was used by most industries and most sectors to say that everyone's doing this, everyone's firing and rehiring at a low rate. And, it almost became a normal thing, and, you were expected to say yes to it. And now suddenly you have a series of different service folks coming together and doing this. So I see these seasons of strikes, or this series of strikes almost as an opposition to this blanketing negotiation strategy that has been used for the last few months. And talking about negotiation strategies here, and those are some really interesting points made by Ebrahim. But Suzanne, one of our consultants at TCM, says this sudden rise must be also something to do with leadership styles and behaviors and how they start impacting the positioning of individuals. So wondering what are your thoughts on this, especially because this is where we are right now. How do we fix this? Is there is there room for empathy in industrial action negotiations? And what is the right approach to be at the table for both sides at this point of time?
I think one thing I've noticed there, Jonathan, I think it's a really good point, that leaders have gone into roles and never been trained. So they've been good at their field. They then get promoted and then manage. And then what they do then is imposter syndrome and replicate the leader that went before them that's probably never been trained. So it becomes a kind of I'll follow the next person and this is how it's done. And I think we keep going to this I win, you lose situation. And that's not negotiating. There's a win-win situation you can clearly get if you really want to listen. And I love the bit about Ebrahim then saying about the right people round the table. You can't negotiate if you're going to do a third-party chat to somebody else. You need those people in the room to have that dialogue, that open dialogue, and really listen. And I just think through our mediation training that you're there to listen and really get those views come in to then actually talk through from that position. But I've still seen in the UK from a managerial point of view or leadership point of view, it's a retributive justice rather than restorative. And actually, I'm kind of seeing a difference there of people will stand our ground, however bad it is. And we've just seen it with our PM in the UK, that he stood his ground for months and months and months and months, but he should have left. No disrespect. It doesn't matter what political view you've got. It should have gone then. And I think there's a leadership style. We've got to kind of broaden our leaders to be more emotionally aware, more emotionally connected, really understand what people are going through rather than just the business, if that makes sense.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that's following on from that as well. The terms of reference that you have, the right people around the table, they need to be people that can make decisions, but you make decisions within a certain framework. And I think the time has now come to introduce what we might call pay ratios. I remember years ago negotiating with a housing association who had made a massive surplus and was wanting to close down the defined benefits pension scheme. And so I said, well, let's open the books and have a look and see what the surplus, knowing that they'd made a lot of money. What is the surplus here? Why should we tell you? That was the answer. And I just feel personally that if we having those kind of conversations, I know, of course, dispute resolution procedures are essential because it's only when they fail that you get industrial action balance. And I think if you get the dispute resolution procedures, all the factors there built in, so that you really are exhausting the process, and it isn't just two people, two egos that have fallen, because that can happen. I've witnessed that as well, where a CEO and a trade union official have a fallout, and all of a sudden, things escalate pretty quickly. That can happen as well. But I think that we now need to be looking at the best effective negotiations, because at the end of the day, things always, well, I should say not always, most of the time, are achieved to a much better standard and a much better outcome when everything is discussed and things are done in agreement, rather than the outcome of a dispute.
And I think to add on to that as well, sorry to jump in.
That's right.
Where I would really not want to work in any of those industries at the moment, because I bet the culture of that organisation is really low. And if you think about it, culture drives, on average, I think it's about 30% more profit, 30% more engagement. People feel really good. People here, if I took a cultural lens, it must be an awful environment to work in. It can't be getting out of bed in the morning going, yay, I'm excited about work. It's more about, oh no, not more problems or issues, etc. And I think that's where a good cultural overview of the organisation needs to be looked at. You can see it quite easily that I bet if I was to go and have a focus group with each of those colleagues, I'd probably get the similar themes around culture, leadership, engagement, those kind of parts, listening skills. I reckon you see a bit of common theme, if that makes sense.
Well, that's right. And within TCM, Stephen, we say all the time, conflict is inevitable.
Yes.
There's something wrong if trade unions and the employers always agree. Of course there is. The issue is how you deal with that conflict.
Yeah.
and it's how you work your way around. And of course, trust has to be built, and in the outcome of dispute, it's rebuilding trust. Now that can and that does happen. We're thankful to say, but
yeah, Jonathan,
something does need to change.
Yeah, well, I mean, the solutions are, I think for me, it's becoming more and more clear in the work that I do that often we have a lot of the headspace work, which we can do quite easily and intellectualizes. And I think that's quite important because we can gain perspective. Often where the parties are in the heart space, and this is, I think, where they are. And the question potentially would be is that what happens at this stage in the immediacy? And I don't know. I mean, of course, it would require some very careful creative solutions, interventions, and the like. And I think it's well within the reach of the capacity within the professionals that exist there. It's a matter of reaching out to the right people, getting them around the table, and ensuring that potentially this process goes well. But what I do know, of course, having worked in a lot of collective bargaining disputes in South Africa, is that after issues like this is what happens next. And I think often what you're talking about
Right.
is the intrinsic impact to the work relationship. Now, what we found is that, of course, is that if the parties to these relationships resolve the issue and just go back to normal, you do get repetitive behavior. You potentially get a lot of anxiety for the next negotiations. It backs up against the wall, and a whole lot of other dynamics exist. So you've got to do cleaning up of the history. Okay, else you can't
Right.
expect the relationship to automatically come into place. So an interesting process, timing wise, is important that we utilize here, and it's been utilized in other places, is what is called a integrated relationship building by objectives process. And what this does is, of course, where parties need to agree to it, the right people from the organization and the trade unions get around the table. They work through a training process, which is carefully constructed. They then do a review and assessment of their past negotiations and highlight the key areas and themes. And it's them doing the introspection. It's not that the facilitators facilitate this. And then a careful plan put into place with a steering committee that monitors it. The solutions need to come from within. And then, of course,
Right.
very carefully considering every one of the elements. Now, I'm not selling this as the process to resolve the dispute. What I'm simply saying is that there's a very sophisticated process model required after this that's going to
Right.
do the work that is required and help the parties on their path. Okay, so I think a lot of work to be done, but certainly professionals with the capacities that are around the table and probably hearing this year, and especially within the country, should be called upon, because I think if we're looking for answers in other places where people don't have this necessary skills and knowledge and the balance of interest, you're going to get the wrong assistance. And I think that's potentially the risk that parties may face. So there's wonderful ideas by Stephen and Andy, and I think it needs to be constructed in a way that the process model is understood, the outcomes are understood, but there must be clear deliverables within 6 months, a year. So hopefully that they get on the right track, so to speak.
And I love that, Ebrahim, because I was just reflecting. I worked in the banking industry for 26 years. And towards the probably last 5-6 years of it, since the banking crisis 2008, every year there was a restructure. Every single year there was a restructure. And when that restructure was done, then colleagues were on edge for the following year. They were then worried about what's going to happen, which they would naturally go back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. They start to think about their own security, their protection, their safety. So they're less productive. Whereas actually, there was never any kind of work afterwards about what could we learn from this process. And that went on for 12, 13, 14 years. And it was horrendous. It wasn't a very nice place to be. But customers didn't get the great service. Productivity was okay. But I just think that's a great way of actually learning, and then it doesn't happen again and go through that awful process. I think it's a really good feedback.
Brilliant, gentlemen. I think you have given a lot of insight into how did we get here, how can we fix it, and of course, how can we avoid it. Very quick input to wrap this up. Now, this could, of course, inspire a lot of movement in the private sector as well. We have heard of reports of mass resignations, of really high layoffs happening, people resigning. in different regions across the world. And what are the learnings for leaders, managers, HR, I would say personnel in the private sector? Because this is, of course, this is tremendous, and this is obviously going to inspire the private sector as well. So, what do you think are the quick learnings for them as as we move into the second half of 2022?
I mean, if you look at, for example, HR, the vacancy rate is something like 400% of what it was prior to the pandemic. Lots of people leaving roles and moving on, and so on and so forth. That's just one area. I'm aware of that because of the space at which we work in. But my comment would be, I would think carefully about the package that you're offering people. Offer the very best that you can, and work out initially what will it cost if that person leaves. Because very often, you know what it's like, there's a massive cost to recruiting, selecting, getting new people on board. Obviously, it depends on the size of your organization and whether you really require this. But particularly in areas where it's difficult to find people, I would consider being as generous as you possibly can for that very reason. And obviously retention, you're retaining skills, you're retaining knowledge, and that's all positive. So I think that would be my main thought and consideration.
I just think from my point of view, it's about being genuine, Jonathan. So actually words and actions have to mirror. So your values and behaviors have to mirror. And I just think when the organizations get that right, people flourish. And it's not all of, I know Andy said about the best you can give, and I agree with that, but it's not all about pounds and pence. It's about how people feel. And especially we've gone through the pandemic the last 2 years, the ecosystem has changed, and what people need or want anymore has changed. So actually people want to spend more time with their family, got more comfortable, they can realize that. So I think organizations, if you are a genuine, inclusive organizations, please live and breathe the values and behaviors. Because I see so much disconnect where people say we are an inclusive organization and they still have terrible old restorative processes, policies, etc., and they still manage them as a work hard, play hard kind of 1980s methodology. I just think let's see people being genuine. That's what I'd love to see in this kind of moving forward.
That's right. Very often people talk about values, but they think, oh, we've got to have some values.
Yeah.
just input some values, but that's absolutely true. You have to be authentic, don't you?
Yes. Yeah.
No, that's a wonderful point, Stephen. It's one that I've got here as well. But of course, I think what for me would be the opportunity to look at what would be the internal social dialogue processes that are in place. Are we really listening to each other? I think more than anything, we cannot manage by instinct and habit of what worked in the past. If we're talking about true collaboration and understanding what workers require, where we talk about inclusivity, as Stephen has indicated, then we need to be sincere to that. And being sincere to that is ensuring that those processes that are internally in place, that are preemptive, they're there to assist management. Unfortunately, a lot of management see this as a bugbear to have these processes. And we need to have a different dialogue between lawyers, legal advisors, HR practitioners, and managers to ensure that there's a greater practicality around that, but still achieving those process objectives. And I think we need to enhance, as much as we think we don't know, I think this has been a wheel that's been invented a long time ago. And often we just go and try and invent something new. So for me, often my advice is, whether it's listening, process, internal mechanisms, go back to basics and ensure that it works.
Awesome. Thanks, Ebrahim. So I guess the general message is go back to the process, trust the process. And, if you have the right people at the table, you will have that constructive dialogue. And I think that's what's lacking out here. This has been a brilliant session. Of course, we got breaking news just before we started, a report saying that the Prime Minister of the UK has resigned, but I don't think that's the solution to the problem. And I think all of us agree to that. This is much more deeper with regards to communication and leadership. And I think they're going to keep following the communication that comes through, over the next couple of weeks and see how this pans out. We hope that this is going to be the only episode on the seasonal strikes, but I'm guessing that we will have to revisit this a couple of months later and see where we are. But this has been fantastic, gents. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks, Ebrahim. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks, Stephen. Andy, good to be with you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.